Let's move on from who is leading on Minnesota to what is happening on the ground. Border Czar Tom Homan has already arrived and met with Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. Homan will oversee ICE operations there after Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino's departure. President Trump weighed in on that earlier.
I don't think it's a pullback. It's a little bit of a change. Everybody in this room that has a business, you make little changes. Bovino is very good, but he's a pretty out there kind of a guy. And in some cases, that's good. Maybe it wasn't good here.
So far, these personnel changes haven't stopped the protests or the agitation. People are still marching through the streets, demanding federal law enforcement get out of Minneapolis. I spoke all about this earlier with Ben Shapiro, Daily Wire co-founder and co-host of The Ben Shapiro Show. Just looking at this Minneapolis situation, given the coverage that you and I have both done over the last couple of years, last decade now, really on the left and the way that they've organized, I see this as defund the police 2.0 combined with a very far left, almost communist agenda that they're carrying out in Minneapolis with the organizing, not just protests where people show up with signs, but the tracking, the doxing, the signal chats. What is your assessment of what's really going on right now in that city?
It does feel like a chaos operation. It feels very, very organized. Obviously, it is designed to impede federal law enforcement, and not just to impede federal law enforcement, but to end with some tragic situations like the ones that we've seen the past couple of weeks involving Renee Good and Alex Preddy. The more of these ugly pictures people see on their TV, the less they like ICE doing its actual job. And I think that is part of the goal here. Obviously, the people who are arriving at these points are not there, as you say, to protest. They're there to actually obstruct the implementation of federal law. And once you're doing that, you're engaged in violation of law. And that means that whatever happens next is going to be risky and could be dangerous. And I think that is part of the point. I think that a lot of the people who are organizing this stuff know that going in, even if many of the protesters / obstructionists actually don't. I think that a lot of those people seem to be cosplaying the revolution and then seem to be surprised when that meets with actual force from federal law enforcement.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch the martyrdom that's coming out of this. When you had the lieutenant governor telling protesters to, quote, put their bodies on the line. We have literature from these activist groups passing it out in their training manuals to do exactly that. And then when you see it happen and there is death involved, terribly, tragically, there's then martyrs for them to point to and say, see, this is what's happening with ICE. We've seen that play out in other countries, and now we're seeing it happening here in this playbook that's being used in Minneapolis.
I think that's right. I think it's a weaponization of American sympathy in bad situations. And this is one of the problems with a camera-covered society, is that because the job of law enforcement is always going to require use of force, and because that use of force is very rarely going to be fun to look at or pretty to look at, that means that the more you can put those pictures in front of people, especially pictures involving terrible situations like Renee Good or Alex Preddy, the more people are going to reject the entire infrastructure of what ICE is trying to do. And this is what you see a lot of top-level Democratic officials doing. They're not saying this is a tragic circumstance. They're saying ICE should pull completely out of Minneapolis. ICE should apparently stop pursuing even criminal illegal aliens. ICE should apparently disband. Well, that's a form of state nullification, and that's a violation of federal law and the basis upon which the country continues to operate. And so what you're watching here is ideologically unbelievably dangerous.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you about the personnel changes. The president has now taken Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino out of Minneapolis, has sent Tom Homan in. There's some talk from people like John Fetterman, senator from Pennsylvania, Democrat, about Kristi Noem needing to be fired or to resign. Is this overblown, or do you think that the personnel shakeup will help the president continue his operations while you still have the mayor of Minneapolis saying that they're not going to comply with federal immigration law on the local level?
I don't think anyone understands optics better than the president of the United States. I think that he is legitimately the best in the business. And so when he looks at the problems at the top of DHS or at the top of Border Patrol in terms of their communication strategy, and he says this is a bad communication strategy, I think his instincts on this are correct. I think that one thing you cannot have is leaders of our law enforcement community making what appear to be false statements about tape that we can all see. And so when you have Kristi Noem or when you have Greg Bovino saying that Alex Preddy, for example, arrived to massacre federal agents, and then you actually watch the tape and it doesn't appear that he's attempting to massacre federal agents, I think that creates a perceptual gap that is very dangerous for ICE. It means that people don't trust federal law enforcement, that they don't trust investigations of federal law enforcement, and that means that you're going to get more resistance. It means that you're going to get more ugly situations in the streets. if the Trump administration wants to facilitate trust in law enforcement, which clearly they do think, I think, need to move aside people who have done a poor job at communicating the mission of ICE and also being clear about what exactly ICE has done and what investigations will take place. Tom Homan has been very responsible in his rhetoric. I cannot say the same for the Secretary of Homeland Security or for Greg Bovino over at Border Patrol.
I'm so glad you brought up the issue of watching law enforcement play out, because we've heard a lot of accusations that these agents aren't trained. They need to do more training. They don't know what they're doing. And my response is, these are BORTAC agents from Border Patrol, which is essentially the Special Forces wing of Border Patrol. These are ICE agents who are trained to take on violent cartels, gangbangers, murderers, rapists, child predators in these neighborhoods. They're not trained to handle things nicely. They are trained to handle very dangerous people. When you surround them with agitators, with loud whistles, with impeding their investigations, without backup from local police, it sets up a scenario for very, very bad things to happen. And so they're trying to carry out their mission. But you also have people like California Governor Gavin Newsom, of course, getting involved here, trying to take political advantage of this. He's called the ICE agents and Border Patrol agents Gestapo. What is your response to these Democrats at these high national levels continuing to compare people who are carrying out lawfully passed, voted on, and endorsed in the last presidential election immigration laws to Nazi Germany?
I mean, obviously it's terrible. And not only that, it's incredibly, incredibly risky and dangerous, because when you tell people that they are resisting the Gestapo, that they're resisting the Nazis, they're resisting the jackbooted fascists who are tearing down Americans' doors, they feel like they are doing something virtuous. And you're going to obviously increase the number of confrontations, the amount of friction between American citizens and federal law enforcement. And just by sheer dint of numbers, if you have a lot of confrontations of that sort, there's a high likelihood that some of those confrontations are going to go wrong, because officers have to make these judgments in the moment. I mean, you've seen all of these tapes that are frame by frame breakdowns, but you know, for normal human beings, you don't experience things happening on a frame by frame level. You experience them as a holistic situation happening right in front of you. And so if you're a federal law enforcement agent, for example, and there are several of you wrestling Alex Preddy to the ground and somebody shouts gun, you have to assume that Alex Preddy has a gun if you're not the officer who's holding the gun. And if there's an accidental shot fired from that gun, and so you hear someone shout gun and then you hear a gunshot, it is certainly not outside the realm of possibility that the person who's currently resisting arrest and who had a gun in your mind is now providing a potential threat to you. This sort of situation becomes significantly more common and becomes significantly more predictable when you increase the amount of friction, again, between American citizens and law enforcement. Democratic officials are doing this. Again, I think it's part of a planned chaos operation designed to undermine the implementation of federal law.
The ongoing tensions in Minnesota weren't the only thing I was able to talk to Ben Shapiro about. The host of The Ben Shapiro Show also had plenty to say about what America has been doing abroad, and even weighed in on that very bizarre Kanye West apology, and also the Doomsday Clock. Here's part of that conversation, part two. I want to get your take on what's happening overseas. You know, of course, we're hearing these horrific stories coming out of Iran, tens of thousands of innocent people potentially murdered in the streets in the most heinous way by the Iranian regime. President Trump has said that Iran is ready to make a deal, but when you see the reporting, they're not. They may have stopped the planned hangings, but they aren't stopping the killing. What do you think is going to happen here?
Well, I mean, I think that the president set a red line, and then I think Iran jumped over that red line with both feet. And if there's one thing that you don't want to do with President Trump, it is tempt fate. If you believe that you're going to jump over President Trump's red line and that he's not going to do anything about it, I think Iran probably has another think coming. The president was extraordinarily overt in his messaging. He said to the Iranian people they should stay out in the streets, and the direct quote was, "Help is on the way." Well, if help does not materialize in any way for the Iranians, who have now sacrificed themselves possibly by the tens of thousands in order to attain overthrow of the regime, then that would be a signal failure on the part of the administration. I don't think that President Trump is in the habit of doing that sort of thing.
The Monroe Doctrine, which of course is about the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's acting president now says she's had enough of U.S. orders. She, of course, is a Maduro loyalist. Cuba is also in a position where the president says that the regime could be going soon. What do you think Trump's next move should be, given that she is part of the same infrastructure that Maduro was part of and hindrance to the country moving forward?
I think that his plan is probably to economically squeeze that regime. And that seems to be what he is doing. All of the oil revenues that are flowing out via the United States. All funding that is coming into Venezuela is coming in only with the permission of the United States. The question is going to be, if she resists, what are the consequences? I think it would be quite unwise of her to do that. Obviously, the president didn't authorize a full-scale invasion of Venezuela with hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of troops on the ground, because he is hoping that by putting economic pressure and the possibility of a coup on the table, that the leadership there will essentially do the bidding of the United States and eventually transition into something more democratic. The question is what the plan is to achieve that. But if she starts throwing up serious obstacles, I would be very, very doubtful there will be no consequences along those lines. And I think that she knows that as well.
Yeah, I think she does know that as well. And I think that Maduro, who's in a New York prison, has a lot of information that he's happy to hand over to the United States government about Russia and the way that Iran was building drone plants in that country to try and save himself from a worse consequence. So we'll see what happens. Getting to pop culture now, you and I both know that culture is upstream from politics. Kanye West, have to ask you about him. He's back again with another apology. He took out a whole ad in the Wall Street Journal apologizing for basically turning into a Nazi and, saying horrific things about Jews all over the world, all over the country. And he's blaming his mental health. Is that about that, or is it because he has a new album coming out at the end of the month?
I have no idea. I will say that from the very beginning, Kanye has been a bipolar person. Obviously, been suffering from bipolar. The reality is that many of his comments seem to be happening in the throes of mania. This is something that's been continuously ongoing for at least a decade. Now, I don't blame Kanye West nearly as much as I blame his enablers. There are many public figures, particularly on the right, who have made a good stock and trade out of pretending that Kanye West is not only well, but insightful while being in the throes of manic episodes, and then treating his bizarre commentary as though it contains grains of truth or untold depths. I mean, one particular host did an interview while he was on Fox News and sliced out all the elements of the interview that portrayed Kanye in his worst possible light, including references to Hitler and the Nazis, allegedly. And all of that was done in an effort to sort of prop up the idea that actually Kanye is perfectly well and the stuff that he's saying is very important. Again, I don't blame mentally ill people for suffering from mental illness. I know too many of them, like truly mentally ill people, and they're not responsible for what they say. But if you're a person who then treats a mentally ill person as a way of making cash happen or clicks happen, and you use their mental illness as a way of propping up some of the ugliest views and mainstreaming your own, that is significantly more blameworthy to me than a person in the throes of mental illness who is seeking attention and then receiving it.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Well, speaking of bad things in Doomsday, earlier today, the famous Doomsday Clock was moved 4 seconds closer to midnight, which is also known as the end of humanity. And the group who controls the clock cited nuclear war, not great, and AI for the increased risk. Do you think this is accurate? What does Ben Shapiro say about the future of Doomsday and when it's coming?
Man, the Doomsday Clock is one of the dumbest things in American life. I mean, truly in international life. It's a bunch of pseudoscientists who sit around pretending that they actually can calculate when the end of humanity will happen. And, I'll take it seriously when they actually say Doomsday is here. Until then, no, I don't think that the risk of Doomsday is upon us anytime soon.
I don't need a plan for Doomsday. I'm sure we'll know when it has arrived. I'm pretty sure we'll all know.
I don't think we need a clock, correct.
Exactly. Ben Shapiro, thank you so much. Great to see you.
You too.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.